Hi kids, it's Miss Sabrina here again. Welcome and thank you for joining us for another GP Kids lesson. We're so happy that you've come here today to learn more about Jesus. Over the summer, we've been learning all about Jesus' time here on earth, and more specifically, we've been learning about the many miracles he performed during his earthly ministry in the last few weeks, proving that he is God. That truth brings me so much comfort, hope, and peace, especially during uncertain times. So go ahead and check out this week's Bible story video, and I'll be back right after to discuss it with you.
Jesus had been teaching crowds of people by the Sea of Galilee. It was getting late, so he told his disciples to get into the boat and go to the other side of the sea. Jesus sent the crowds away and went up on the mountain to pray by himself. That evening, the boat was far from the shore. The wind blew and the waves tossed the boat around. Jesus was still on the mountain alone. Around 3 a.m, Jesus came toward his disciples walking on the sea. When the disciples saw Jesus, they were terrified. "It's a ghost!" they cried. Right away, Jesus spoke to them. "Have courage, it's me. Do not be afraid." Peter answered, "Lord, if it really is you, tell me to come to you on the water." So Jesus said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw how strongly the wind was blowing, he was afraid. Peter began to sink. "Lord, save me!" he cried. Jesus reached out his hand and grabbed Peter. Jesus said, "You have little faith. Why do you doubt?" They got into the boat and the wind stopped. Then everyone in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Jesus proved that he can be trusted. His miracles, teaching, death, and resurrection showed that he is who he says he is. Only Jesus can save us when we look to him in faith.
We're going to be in Matthew 14 today for our Bible story lesson. But again, I encourage you to read the other accounts in the book of Mark and John with your families when you have time. So this week's story picks up where last week's story left off. Jesus had just finished feeding over 5,000 people with 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish. And, he and the disciples had sent everybody away. And then Jesus told the disciples to go ahead and go back across the sea. And he left to go up to the mountain to pray and have some alone time with God. So that is such an important reminder for us that Jesus would take that time to be alone for himself, to regenerate and rest, and also to be alone with God. So let's go back into Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22, and read about what happened next. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So we see here that while Jesus was praying, his disciples were struggling to cross the sea because a storm came up and tossed their boat around. They weren't making any progress and they were afraid. So let's go ahead and close our eyes for a second and try and put ourselves in that scene. Can you imagine what the disciples were feeling as the waves were coming up over the boat and the wind was blowing everything everywhere. And there were a lot of people on that boat. So I imagine that played out very differently depending on each one of their personalities and how they reacted to stress and fear and uncertainty. So just think about that while we continue. Go ahead and open your eyes. So after the disciples had been battling the storm all night, they look out and they see a figure out on the water, walking on the water. Can you believe that? Who do they think it was? They thought it was a ghost, right? But no, it was Jesus just out there. Again, walking on the water. Can you even believe that? It's so crazy to think about, right? So what do you think you would have thought it was? It says in verse 26 that they were so terrified because, again, they thought it was a ghost. But then Jesus spoke to them and told them not to be afraid. I love that. We've talked before a lot about how many verses there are in the Bible where God reassures us because we do not need to be afraid because he is with us. And here, Jesus is telling the disciples not to be afraid because he is literally with them. So what happened next? He's literally with them, walking on the water, just out there walking. But what happened next? Peter still questioned whether or not it was Jesus out there on the water and asked him to prove that he was who he said he was by saying, "Come, tell me to come out onto the water." So Jesus did. He said, "Come on out." And then what happened? So Peter, as long as he had his eyes fixed on Jesus, he was just out there, again, walking on the water with Jesus, right? Until what? Until he took over and allowed his fear to take over. And then he began to sink, and Jesus had to rescue him. They got into the boat, and the wind immediately stopped. And it says in verse 33, those in attendance that were there worshipped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So Jesus proved that he was the Son of God and that he is God by performing the miracle of walking on the water. But there are so many other important lessons to be learned from this story. Notice how, after meeting the needs of the people, Jesus took some time to go and be alone with God. You know, our lives are so busy, and it is so easy to get wrapped up in that busyness and forget to not only take time to rest, but to go be alone with God. God modeled this in the very beginning when he made the world, and Jesus modeled that again here in this story. Don't forget to take time not only to rest, but to have time alone with God in your life regularly. We also learned something about trusting Jesus here. Peter asked Jesus to prove himself to him, and Peter did. So he stepped out onto the water in faith. But I think the bigger lesson is the work that had already been done. Jesus was already out there walking on the water. That should have been proof enough to everybody. He was walking on water, and yet Peter still doubted and questioned. Just like he had already proven himself to Peter by walking on the water and then rescuing him from the water, Jesus has already proven himself to us by dying on the cross and rescuing us from our sins. We also had another important reminder here about fear, right? The moment Peter took his eyes off of Jesus and gave in to his fear was when he started to be in trouble, right? Whenever your faith is in doubt or you are wavering with that, rest in that Jesus proved over and over to us that he is who he says he is, he does what he says he does, and we can rest in his finished work. It is sufficient for me and it's sufficient for you. Keep or fix your eyes on him. God has promised us over and over again that he will never leave us or forsake us. Before we go, let's go to Pastor Brian with our questions from Kids Video this week and learn some more about how we can grow in our faith.
Hi there, I'm Pastor Brian, and it's time for Questions from Kids. Julia from East Orange, New Jersey asks,
how can I have a stronger faith?
Oh, Julia, that is a question we all need to keep asking ourselves. Great question. So here's the thing. We know that faith needs to be grown. It's kind of like a muscle. Some people have called it a muscle that you have to keep exercising and stretching it so it grows and becomes stronger. And so how do we do that? Well, there are a few ways that we can do that. The first one I can think of is by spending more time in the Bible. The more we read the Bible, the more we study it, the more we understand who God is, the way he works, the greater confidence we have in him. We know how we're to live. And so reading the Bible is perhaps one of the greatest ways you can grow in your faith. Other ways are prayer, talking with God, asking Him to grow you, asking Him to help you learn and to live on faith. Another way is by worshiping, being part of a church. This is why it's so important that we're part of a family of faith and we gather regularly and worship together and study together and talk through these things, learn from one another. But all these things lead us to this one idea that I think is really important you hear. You have to stretch your faith. You have to put yourself in positions that are uncomfortable at times to grow in that faith. Think again about muscles. Think about, lifting weights. Lifting weights is not easy. You have to strain and stretch yourself and you add more weight and there are times you're like, I don't know if I can do this, but you keep pushing. And it's through that exertion that your muscles grow stronger. If you never put weights on the barbell and just lifted an empty barbell, you're not gonna really gain muscle. So it's the same thing with our faith. If we're never stretching ourselves, if we're never stepping into those uncomfortable areas of life, if we're never sitting down with that person in the cafeteria and praying that God opens a conversation to talk about your faith with him or her, then you're not gonna grow as much. It's through those uncomfortable, stretching moments that we really grow. So I wanna encourage you to do that. Share your faith with other people. Go on mission trips. Live for Christ day by day, and you will see your faith grow by leaps and bounds, I believe, when you do that. So I hope that has been helpful, and again, that's something that we all need to be doing. So question back for you, who or what are you looking to be secure? Where is your faith found?
We are so happy that you joined us here today. I want to encourage you to do the things that Pastor Brian mentioned in the Questions from Kids video and the things that we've talked about in ways that you can grow your faith. Talk to your families about those and actively work on growing in your faith. We pray that these videos are beneficial to you and your families as you seek to grow in your love for God and for others. Take care, and we'll see you again next week.